In the vast wilderness, where nature writes its own rules, a desperate cry for help echoed across the savannah. A baby elephant, innocent and vulnerable, found itself trapped in the merciless currents of a river that showed no compassion for its youth. What happened next, when a hippopotamus approached the struggling calf, left every witness at the safari camp speechless with disbelief. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The sun hung mercilessly over the Okavango Delta, a fierce white disk that seemed determined to drain every drop of moisture from the parched landscape. Cracks, like ancient hieroglyphics, etched themselves across the baked earth, telling stories of water long departed. The safari camp, usually bustling with excited chatter and activity, had surrendered to a drowsy stillness as guests retreated to their tents, seeking respite from the relentless heat. Grace, the 67-year-old retired schoolteacher from Manchester, dabbed at her forehead with a handkerchief as she sat beneath the meager shade of an acacia tree. Her first African adventure was proving more challenging than anticipated, but there was something about this harsh beauty that spoke to her soul. She watched as camp staff moved languidly between tasks, their movements economical in the oppressive temperature. Along the riverbank, a silent negotiation played out. Animals gathered in uneasy proximity. Impala, zebra, and the occasional kudu, their usual territorial disputes temporarily suspended by their shared need for water and shade. The river itself had shrunk to half its normal size, leaving exposed sandbars where crocodiles basked with jaws agape, conserving energy. Naledi, the young tracker whose keen eyes missed nothing, pointed toward a small herd of elephants approaching from the east. "The matriarch brings her family," she whispered to Grace. "They will drink, then seek shade until evening." The retired teacher watched in fascination as the elephants moved with surprising grace for creatures of such size. The matriarch led confidently, her massive body creating a living shield for the younger members of the herd. Behind her trundled several juveniles and, most endearing of all, a baby elephant whose trunk still curled awkwardly as it attempted to mimic its elders. Without warning, the peaceful tableau shattered. A surge of water, released upstream without notice, rushed through the riverbed, swelling the placid flow into a churning current. The baby elephant, who had ventured too close to the edge, lost its footing on the slippery bank. With a terrified trumpet, the calf tumbled into the suddenly violent water. The matriarch's cry split the air like thunder, a primal sound of distress that jolted every creature within earshot. She rushed toward the water's edge, trunk extended helplessly as the current swept her baby beyond reach. The other elephants joined her panic, trumpeting and pacing along the bank. In the camp, heads snapped up at the commotion. Guests emerged from tents, guides grabbed binoculars, and within moments the entire camp was rushing toward the unfolding drama. Grace found herself moving without conscious thought, her heart pounding as she followed Naledi toward the riverbank, where human and elephant alike watched in horror as the baby fought against the merciless pull of the water. The safari vehicles screeched to a halt as guides shouted alerts in both English and Setswana. Within moments, the entire camp, tourists and staff alike, had abandoned their activities and were rushing toward the riverbank. Grace clutched her sun hat as she hurried alongside the others, her heart pounding against her ribs. At the water's edge, the scene was chaos. The baby elephant thrashed desperately, its small trunk raised above the churning water like a periscope. The current, unusually strong from upstream water releases, pulled the calf farther from shore with each passing second. The matriarch trumpeted in distress, pacing frantically along the bank, her massive feet kicking up clouds of dust. "It won't survive much longer," whispered a guide standing next to Grace, his binoculars trained on the struggling calf. Naledi, who had sprinted ahead of the group, stood with her hand shielding her eyes. "Look there," she shouted, pointing toward a ripple in the water several meters from the baby elephant. The surface broke in an explosion of spray and muscle. A massive hippo, easily weighing 2 tons, emerged with surprising speed. The crowd gasped collectively as the enormous beast swam directly toward the flailing calf. Several tourists raised their devices, capturing what they assumed would be a tragic confrontation. But what happened next defied all expectations. Instead of attacking, the hippo positioned its bulky body between the elephant and the strongest part of the current. The great beast planted its feet firmly on the riverbed, creating a living breakwater. The baby elephant, exhausted but instinctively understanding, pressed against the hippo's side, finding momentary shelter from the rushing water. "I've never seen anything like this," murmured one of the senior guides, his voice barely audible over the rushing water. "Hippos typically avoid elephants completely. For nearly 5 minutes, the hippo remained immobile, allowing the calf to regain strength while using its massive body as a shield. Then, as if coordinating their movements, the hippo began nudging the baby elephant toward a gentler section of the bank where the matriarch waited, trunk extended. When the calf finally scrambled onto solid ground, collapsing in exhaustion at its mother's feet, a cheer erupted from the onlookers. The hippo lingered for a moment, its small eyes visible above the waterline, before submerging and disappearing downstream. Grace stood transfixed, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Around her, the camp's visitors and staff embraced one another, united in their witness of something extraordinary. Even the documentary crew, who had arrived just in time to capture the rescue, stood in reverent silence, their cameras temporarily forgotten. Nature had just rewritten its own rules before their eyes. Grace Wilkins stood transfixed at the riverbank, her weathered hands trembling against her chest. At 67, the retired schoolteacher from Manchester had seen many things in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the drama unfold, fear and fascination mingling in her wide eyes as the massive hippo positioned itself beneath the struggling elephant calf. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," she whispered to no one in particular, her Manchester accent more pronounced in her state of agitation. The safari guide beside her explained that such behavior was unprecedented. Grace barely heard him. This was why she had come to Botswana, wasn't it? To witness something real, something transformative. After 43 years of teaching mathematics to uninterested teenagers, retirement had left her adrift. The shadows of powerlessness that had haunted her since her husband's death 5 years ago had only deepened in the silence of her empty home. Africa was supposed to be her escape, a final adventure before age made such journeys impossible. Now, as the hippo guided the elephant calf to safety, Grace felt something stir within her that she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. When the immediate danger passed and the other tourists returned to camp chattering excitedly about what they'd witnessed, the retired teacher remained. She settled on a flat rock overlooking the delta, pulled out her leather-bound journal, and began to sketch. Her hands, once unsteady, moved with surprising precision as she captured the hippo's massive form and the tiny elephant's vulnerable trunk raised in what looked almost like gratitude. "You're quite good at that," came a voice behind her. Grace turned to find one of the younger guides watching her work. She smiled self-consciously, covering her drawing partially with her hand. "Just a hobby," she replied. "But this, I needed to record it somehow. There's something important here, something I can't quite name yet." The guide nodded respectfully before moving on, leaving Grace to her thoughts. She continued sketching, adding notes in her neat teacher's handwriting along the margins. Questions formed faster than she could write them. Why would a hippo, normally territorial and aggressive, save a baby elephant? What did it mean about the nature of compassion? About the connections between species? As the African sun began its descent, casting golden light across the delta, Grace realized she felt more alive than she had in years. This wasn't just a holiday anymore. This was the beginning of something. With careful strokes of her pencil, she committed every detail to paper, determined to understand the deeper meaning behind this astonishing encounter. As darkness fell over the Okavango Delta, the camp came alive with a different kind of energy. Staff members arranged logs in a perfect circle around the central fire pit, and soon flames leapt high into the star-filled sky. Grace Thompson settled onto a cushioned stool, her journal clutched tightly in her weathered hands, watching as other tourists gradually joined the gathering. "Tonight, we share the stories of our ancestors," announced Cabo, the head guide, his voice deep and melodious against the backdrop of crackling wood. "The Tswana people have lived alongside these animals for countless generations." The firelight cast dancing shadows across the faces of those gathered. Grace noticed how Naledi sat slightly apart, her eyes reflecting the flames as she prepared to translate some of the more complex cultural nuances for the foreign guests. "The hippo is not just an animal to us," an elder staff member explained, his hands gesturing expressively. "In our traditions, Kubu, the hippo, is the unexpected guardian, the protector who emerges when all seems lost." He paused, looking meaningfully at the guests. "What you witnessed today has deep meaning in our culture." Grace leaned forward, her Manchester pragmatism suddenly confronted by something she couldn't easily categorize. The tracker continued, describing how elephants represented memory and endurance, carrying the wisdom of generations in their long lives. "They remember every kindness and every wrong," Naledi translated softly for Grace. "That is why the matriarch will never forget what the hippo did for her calf." Around the fire, Other staff members added their own family tales, stories of animals acting as messengers between worlds, of unexpected alliances in times of drought, of wisdom passed down through observation of the natural world. Grace found herself scribbling frantically in her journal, not just recording the words, but trying to capture the reverence in their voices. Her scientific mind wanted to dismiss these as mere superstitions, yet something deeper responded to the sincerity and respect these people showed toward the natural world. "In your countries, you separate yourselves from nature," Cabu observed, looking around the circle. "Here, we understand we are part of the same story." The retired schoolteacher felt something shift inside her as the night progressed. These weren't just folk tales, but a different way of seeing, one that honored connection rather than separation. For the first time since arriving in Botswana, Grace felt a sense of belonging, as if these stories were creating space for her in this unfamiliar landscape. When the gathering finally dispersed, she remained by the dying embers, watching the sparks rise toward the vast African sky. The logical walls she had built throughout her 67 years were beginning to show the first hairline cracks. The sky darkened without warning, clouds gathering like conspirators above the parched delta. Grace Thompson stood at the edge of her tent, watching as the first heavy droplets struck the dust, sending small plumes of earth skyward. Within minutes, the gentle patter transformed into a torrential downpour that drummed against canvas and tin roofs throughout the safari camp. "Early rains," muttered one of the guides, shaking his head in disbelief. 2 weeks ahead of schedule." For 3 days, the deluge continued unabated. The once cracked earth turned to thick, clinging mud that sucked at boots and tires alike. The river, previously a lazy ribbon cutting through the landscape, swelled into a churning, coffee-colored force that devoured its banks and reshaped the familiar terrain. Camp life transformed overnight. Safari vehicles sat idle, unable to navigate the newly formed swamps and waterlogged tracks. Meals became communal affairs in the main lodge as individual cooking areas flooded. Grace found herself sharing breakfast with strangers who quickly became companions in this shared adventure. "The animals will be moving," Naledi explained one evening, her eyes bright with excitement despite the challenges. The young tracker pointed toward the eastern horizon. "The herds will seek higher ground, and the predators will follow." Grace nodded, adding this information to her journal with careful strokes. The retired schoolteacher had already filled several pages with observations of how the sudden environmental shift affected the camp's human inhabitants. Now she turned her attention to the wildlife. From the relative safety of the elevated observation deck, Grace witnessed remarkable adaptations. Antelope that once gathered at distant waterholes now grazed confidently across newly green patches just beyond the camp perimeter. A family of warthogs had claimed territory beneath the elevated walkway, their snorts and grunts becoming part of the camp's soundtrack. Most fascinating was the elephant herd. The matriarch led her family, including the rescued calf, along new pathways carved by the rushing water. They moved with purpose, testing unfamiliar ground with each deliberate step. The hippos, meanwhile, seemed to revel in the abundance of water. Their massive bodies, once confined to deeper pools, now navigated freely through the expanded waterways. Grace spotted the calf's savior among them, distinctive by a notch in its right ear. "Be careful where you walk," Naledi warned Grace one morning, pointing to fresh hippo tracks alarmingly close to the path between tents. "They're exploring new territories now." The warning proved prescient. That very afternoon, Grace rounded a corner to find herself 15 feet from a massive bull hippo that had wandered into camp. Time froze as they regarded each other, the animal's small eyes unreadable, water dripping from its enormous bulk. Grace held her breath until the creature turned away, ambling unhurriedly back toward the swollen river. Her hands trembled as she recorded the encounter, aware that she was witnessing a rare moment when the boundaries between human and wild dissolved completely. The early rains had transformed the landscape, turning the parched earth into a lush, verdant paradise. With this change came shifting animal behaviors that fascinated everyone at the safari camp. The matriarch elephant, towering and majestic, began leading her herd closer to the camp's perimeter, her powerful trunk testing the air as she guided her family toward the reliable water sources near human settlements. Grace watched from the observation deck, her journal open on her lap as she sketched the elephant's deliberate movements. "They've never come this close before," whispered one of the guides, his voice a mixture of awe and concern. The proximity of these massive creatures created a palpable tension among the camp's inhabitants. Some tourists pressed forward eagerly, smartphones raised to capture the magnificent animals, while others retreated nervously to their lodges. The staff members exchanged knowing glances. They understood the delicate balance required when wild animals ventured this close. "The matriarch is smart," Naledi explained to Grace as they observed together one afternoon. "She remembers where water remains, even in the hardest times." The young tracker pointed to the elephant's scarred ear. "See how she keeps her young ones in the middle? She's lived through droughts before." Meanwhile, the river's transformation had created another dramatic shift in the ecosystem. The hippopod that had once claimed the central section of the river found themselves displaced by the swollen waters. Their massive bodies now occupied shallower pools traditionally dominated by crocodiles, creating an uneasy standoff between the species. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, Grace witnessed a tense encounter. 3 enormous hippos stood their ground as 5 crocodiles slithered onto a nearby sandbank. The reptiles, ancient and calculating, seemed to be assessing the situation, their primeval eyes fixed on the hippos. "This could get ugly," muttered a senior guide who had joined Grace on her evening observation. "The crocs have held that territory for generations." Yet instead of conflict, something unexpected occurred. As darkness fell, both species settled into an uneasy coexistence, maintaining distance but sharing the limited space. By morning, Grace noticed smaller animals venturing into this newly protected zone, finding safety in the buffer created by this reluctant alliance. Back at camp, the staff debated what these new animal patterns might mean for their operations. "We may need to adjust our safari routes," suggested the camp manager during the evening briefing, "and reinforce the perimeter fencing." Grace made careful notes, sensing that these shifting relationships between animals and humans were part of a larger story unfolding before her eyes, one that connected deeply to the miraculous rescue she had witnessed just days before. Grace found herself drawn to the quiet figure who often stood at the edge of the group during safari excursions. Naledi, the young tracker whose eyes seemed to catch every movement in the bush before anyone else noticed, had a way of pointing out wildlife that went beyond mere observation. It bordered on communion. One morning, as the camp stirred to life under the orange glow of sunrise, Grace approached Naledi, who was checking tracks near the dining area. "Those aren't from our hippo friend, are they?" she asked, gesturing toward the impressions in the mud. The young woman looked up, surprised at the interest. "No, these are civet tracks from last night," she explained, her voice soft but confident. "They came looking for scraps after dinner." What began as a simple question blossomed into hours of conversation. Grace learned that Naledi had grown up in a village just beyond the delta's reach. The tracker shared how she'd taught herself to read animal signs when other children were playing games, and how she'd fought for her position at the camp despite resistance. "The managers think I should be happy serving meals or cleaning rooms," Naledi confided as they sat together during an afternoon break. "They say tracking is men's work." Her fingers traced patterns in the dirt as she spoke. "But I want to study conservation biology in South Africa, or maybe even England someday." Grace recognized something in the young woman's determination, a quiet fire she herself had once possessed before life's disappointments had dimmed it. "What's stopping you?" she asked. "Money. And no one here takes me seriously enough to write recommendations," Naledi replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon where elephants moved like shadows against the setting sun. In the days that followed, the retired schoolteacher and the aspiring conservationist formed an unlikely alliance. Grace began accompanying Naledi on her early morning tracking rounds, her journal filling with not only animal observations, but also notes on Naledi's remarkable knowledge. Under the vast African sky, they exchanged stories. Grace of her classroom days in Manchester, where she'd tried to inspire children who couldn't see beyond their circumstances, and Naledi of her dreams to protect the wildlife that had been her teachers since childhood. "You remind me of myself," Grace told her one evening as they watched the camp's fire send sparks toward the stars. "But braver." Naledi smiled, the firelight illuminating her face. "And you remind me that it's never too late to start something new." The camp managers watched their growing friendship with curious eyes, unsure what to make of the elderly tourist who preferred the company of staff to other guests. But neither woman cared. They had found in each other something unexpected, a mirror reflecting both past and future possibilities. The morning air shimmered with heat as Grace positioned herself on the observation deck overlooking the river. For the third consecutive day, The elephant calf had appeared at the water's edge precisely when the massive hippo surfaced for air. The young elephant would trumpet softly, almost like a greeting, and then stand at a cautious distance, watching its unlikely savior with unmistakable recognition. "I've never seen anything like it in 20 years as a guide," whispered Empho, the senior tracker, shaking his head in disbelief. "Elephants and hippos typically avoid each other. This behavior is unprecedented." Grace nodded, her weathered fingers carefully sketching the scene in her journal. The Manchester native had developed a routine of waking before dawn to secure the best observation spot. Her pages were filling with detailed accounts of these extraordinary interactions, the way the calf's ears would flap excitedly upon spotting the hippo, how it would edge closer to the water than any of the other elephants dared. "The matriarch allows it," Grace murmured to herself, noting how the powerful female elephant watched vigilantly, but made no move to pull her young one away from the water's edge. She remembers, too. Word of the unusual bond spread quickly through the safari camp. Tourists abandoned morning game drives to witness the phenomenon, cameras ready. The guides struggled to explain what they themselves couldn't comprehend, falling back on Swana folklore about animal spirits and sacred connections. Naledi joined Grace one morning, bringing her a steaming cup of tea. "My grandmother would say the hippo carries the calf's soul now," the young tracker said quietly. "That when you save a life, you become responsible for it forever." Grace looked up from her journal, struck by the poetry in Naledi's words. She added this perspective to her notes, her documentation evolving beyond mere behavioral observations into something more profound, a record of emotional connections that science couldn't easily categorize. The documentary crew predictably arrived at the riverbank with their equipment, disrupting the peaceful ritual with their whispered directions and camera movements. Grace frowned as they positioned themselves, concerned their presence might frighten away the animals. But the bond between calf and hippo proved resilient. Even with the intrusion of humans, the young elephant returned each day, standing sentinel as the hippo patrolled its territory. Sometimes the massive creature would swim closer to shore, as if acknowledging its tiny admirer. "Do you think they understand what happened between them?" a tourist asked Grace, noticing her detailed journal. The retired school teacher closed her notebook thoughtfully. "I believe they understand something we've forgotten," she replied, watching as the calf dipped its trunk into the water, reaching toward the hippo in a gesture that looked remarkably like gratitude. What had begun as a personal record of wonder had transformed into something far more significant. Grace Wilkins's leather-bound journal, initially met with polite smiles and occasional eye rolls from the younger staff members, was now being passed around the camp with reverence. Her detailed sketches of the baby elephant's interactions with the hippo, accompanied by timestamps and behavioral notes, revealed patterns no one had noticed before. "Look here," Naledi said one evening, pointing to a sequence of Grace's drawings. "The elephants always approach the water from the east when the hippopod is present. They're using them as sentinels." The head guide, who had once dismissed Grace's documentation as tourist scribbling, now leaned forward with interest. Her meticulous observations had mapped a clear correlation between hippo locations and elephant drinking patterns that even the most experienced trackers had overlooked. "These notes could help us establish better viewing areas," he admitted, tracing his finger along Grace's careful diagrams, "and keep both our guests and the animals safer." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest as her work became the centerpiece of the evening staff meeting. For decades in Manchester, she had taught children about distant ecosystems, never imagining she would one day contribute to understanding one. The retired school teacher watched as the camp manager photographed several pages to share with conservation authorities. "Your journal might help us create designated safe zones," Naledi told her later as they sat watching the sunset, "places where we know the elephants and hippos coexist peacefully." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Throughout her career, she had often felt her passion for natural science was indulged rather than respected. Even her ex-husband had called her wildlife interests cute hobbies. Now, in her 67th year, strangers were treating her observations with genuine regard. That night, she added new entries by lamplight, her pen moving with renewed purpose. The familiar doubt still whispered at the edges of her mind. Who was she to think her amateur notes mattered? But she pushed it aside. The evidence was clear in how the guides now approached her each morning, asking what she had observed, what patterns she had detected. "Tomorrow we'll adjust the morning drive route based on your hippo sightings," the head guide had told her earlier. "Your work is helping us understand something unprecedented." Grace closed her journal, running her fingers over its worn cover. What had begun as a way to process the miracle she'd witnessed on the river had become something she never expected. Proof that it was never too late to make a meaningful contribution to a world that still held wonders beyond imagination. The safari camp's morning routine was interrupted by the distant rumble of vehicles approaching through the delta. Grace Thompson looked up from her journal, squinting against the harsh sun as 3 automobiles pulled into the clearing. The documentary crew had arrived. 5 people emerged, their equipment already in hand before the dust had settled. Leading them was Marcus Reed, a tall man with a booming voice that carried across the camp. "We heard about the elephant and hippo. Where can we set up? We need the best angles for this story." Grace watched as the camp manager tried to explain the delicate nature of wildlife observation, but Marcus was already directing his team to unpack cameras and recording equipment. The retired schoolteacher felt a knot form in her stomach. These weren't scientists or conservationists. They were storytellers chasing views. "You must be the woman with the journal," a voice said beside her. Grace turned to find a young woman extending her hand. "I'm Sophia, research coordinator for the documentary. We'd love to interview you about what you witnessed." Grace nodded cautiously, clutching her journal closer. The pages contained her meticulous observations, honest, unembellished accounts of the remarkable relationship forming between the animals. She wondered how much of that truth would survive the crew's editing process. By afternoon, the camp's peaceful atmosphere had transformed. Cables snaked between tents, crew members spoke loudly into devices, and the wildlife seemed to sense the intrusion, keeping their distance from the water's edge. "They want me to say the hippo heroically charged to save the baby elephant," Grace confided to Naledi as they sat away from the commotion. "But that's not what happened. It was gentler, more deliberate." The young tracker nodded. "They asked me if the hippo and elephant communicate with each other." "As if they're speaking English," she laughed, but her eyes reflected Grace's concern. When Marcus approached Grace later, his proposal was direct. "We need something more dramatic for the opening sequence. Could you perhaps emphasize the danger? Maybe suggest the hippo might have been aggressive at first?" Grace felt her old timidity rising, the familiar urge to please others. But something had changed in her during these weeks in Botswana. She thought of her journal, of the truth she'd committed to paper. "I can only share what I actually saw," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "The story is remarkable enough without embellishment." Marcus frowned, but moved on to find more cooperative interviewees. Grace watched him go, feeling both anxious and oddly empowered. The documentary would reach thousands, perhaps millions, but her journal held the truth, and somehow that mattered more than she could have imagined before coming to this place. The torrential rains that had begun as a blessing quickly transformed into a nightmare. Water rose with alarming speed, turning pathways into streams and low-lying areas of the camp into murky ponds. Grace Wilkins watched from her slightly elevated cabin as staff scrambled to move equipment to higher ground. The safari vehicles sat abandoned, half-submerged in muddy water. "We need to ration the remaining food," announced the camp manager during an emergency meeting. His usual professional demeanor had given way to visible concern. "The supply truck can't get through the flooded roads for at least 4 days." The news sent ripples of anxiety through the gathered crowd. A businessman from Toronto immediately protested, demanding special treatment given the premium he'd paid. Others joined in with complaints, their voices rising above the constant drumming of rain on the canvas roof. Grace stood quietly, her weathered hands clutching her precious journal. She had documented enough animal behavior to recognize the patterns emerging among the humans, fear driving territorial displays, just as she'd observed along the riverbank. "Perhaps we could organize ourselves like the elephant herd," she suggested, her voice soft but steady. The room fell silent. The matriarch delegate's responsibilities. Everyone has a purpose. Naledi, standing near the back, nodded encouragingly at her friend. "Grace is right. We need structure, not arguments." What followed was remarkable. The retired schoolteacher from Manchester, once dismissed by many as just another tourist, began organizing tasks with quiet authority. She assigned groups to inventory supplies, collect rainwater, and reinforce vulnerable structures. Her journal became command central, its pages now tracking human resources instead of animal movements. "You've got quite the knack for crisis management," remarked one of the documentary crew members, helping Grace distribute the day's meager rations of canned beans and dried fruit. 40 years of managing classrooms full of children," she replied with a wry smile. "This isn't so different." As days passed, the boundaries between guests and staff blurred. A banker from Berlin worked alongside a local guide to repair a leaking roof. The documentary crew's equipment became community property, their satellite phone the camp's lifeline to the outside world. Not everyone adapted easily. Tensions erupted over food portions and sleeping arrangements as more cabins flooded. Grace found herself mediating disputes, her calm presence diffusing anger before it could escalate. At night, huddled together in the main lodge, Naledi would translate traditional Tswana stories about surviving floods. The tales, passed down through generations, provided both practical wisdom and emotional comfort. "We are becoming our own herd," Grace wrote in her journal by lamplight. "Like the animals we came to observe, we're adapting to survive, together." The river surged with renewed force as the night storm pounded the camp. Grace sat beneath the canvas awning, her journal protected from the rain as she sketched the day's observations by lantern light. Naledi appeared from the darkness, her uniform soaked through, water streaming from her braided hair. "May I join you?" the young tracker asked, her voice barely audible above the downpour. Grace nodded, making space on the bench. "You're drenched." "Here," she offered her spare blanket, noticing how Naledi's hands trembled slightly. The two women sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the angry waters of the Okavango churn below the elevated platform. When lightning flashed, Grace caught a glimpse of fear in Naledi's eyes. Not the professional caution she typically displayed, but something deeper. "I hate crossing the river," Naledi finally whispered. "Every time we take the boat, I feel like I might be sick." Grace set her journal aside. "I hadn't noticed. You always seem so confident." Naledi's gaze remained fixed on the water. "My brother Kago nearly drowned in these waters when I was 8. We were playing near the shallows during the dry season, but there was a sudden release upstream." Her voice cracked. "The current took him so quickly. Our uncle pulled him out, but Kago didn't breathe for so long." "Is he?" Grace began. "He survived," Naledi said, "but something in me never recovered from watching him disappear beneath the surface." The confession hung between them, weighty yet somehow lightening the air. Grace thought about how the young tracker crossed the river daily, guiding tourists with steady hands and keen eyes, never betraying the terror that must have gripped her heart. "Yet you became a tracker," Grace marveled, "a job that requires river crossings almost every day." Naledi smiled faintly. "My grandmother said fears faced daily become stepping stones, not walls." She glanced at Grace's journal. "Like you with your writing. The camp manager told me how the documentary crew laughed at your notes initially." Grace felt a flush of embarrassment. They wanted dramatic stories, not careful observations. "But you kept writing anyway," Naledi said. "And now even the senior guides check your journal for animal movement patterns." The rain eased slightly, and in the distance they could hear the low rumble of hippos in the water, including perhaps the very one that had saved the elephant calf. "I suppose we're both crossing our rivers?" Grace said softly. Naledi reached over and squeezed the older woman's hand. "Tomorrow, when we track the matriarch's herd, will you show me how you record their movements? I think your methods could help with my conservation application." Grace felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, a sense of purpose that had eluded her for decades. "I'd be honored," she replied, knowing that their shared vulnerabilities had forged something stronger than either could have built alone. The camp's atmosphere had shifted since the dramatic rescue. 6 weeks had passed, and Grace Thompson's journal had evolved, from a personal diary into something far more significant. Seated beneath the shade of an acacia tree, she carefully added details to her sketch of the matriarch elephant's distinctive torn right ear. "Miss Grace, they're ready for you," Naledi called, approaching with her characteristic light-footed gait. The retired schoolteacher closed her journal and followed the young tracker to the main lodge, where 3 safari guides and the camp manager waited. Spread across the wooden table were maps of the Okavango Delta, marked with colored pins indicating animal sightings. "Your observations have been invaluable," Cabo, the head guide, explained as he gestured toward the maps. "We believe your documentation system could form the basis of a comprehensive wildlife monitoring project." Grace listened intently as they outlined their vision, a coordinated effort to track migration patterns, breeding behaviors, and the increasingly complex interactions between hippos and elephants. The data would help create buffer zones where tourists could safely observe without disrupting natural behaviors. "We've never seen anything like the relationship between that hippo and the elephant calf," Naledi added. "Your notes capture details even our experienced trackers Missed. The camp manager nodded in agreement. The safari company is prepared to fund the initiative if we can demonstrate its value for conservation and tourism. Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with Botswana's heat. For decades, she had taught children about distant ecosystems from textbooks in Manchester. Now her observations were being taken seriously by those who lived and breathed this environment daily. "I'd be honored to help," she said, her voice steady despite her excitement. Over the following days, Grace worked alongside Naledi and the guides, transforming her journaling system into a format others could use. They created standardized observation sheets, established time slots for monitoring key areas, and developed a coding system for behavioral patterns. One evening, as they finalized the project details, Grace paused. "I'll only be here another month," she said quietly. "What happens then?" Naledi placed a hand on her mentor's shoulder. "You've created something that will continue long after you leave," the tracker assured her, "and we'll send you updates. Perhaps you'll return next year to see how it's grown." For the first time in her 67 years, Grace felt she had created something lasting. Back home, her teaching career had touched lives, certainly, but this was different. This might help preserve the delicate balance between humans and wildlife in this remarkable corner of the world. That night, writing by lamplight, she added a new section to her journal, Future Plans. The title alone filled her with purpose she hadn't felt since retiring 3 years ago. The documentary crew surrounded Grace in the dining area of the camp, their cameras and equipment creating a wall between her and the rest of the guests. Marcus, the director, leaned forward with an intensity that made Grace uncomfortable. "We need something more dramatic," he insisted, tapping her journal. "Maybe the hippo actually charged at a crocodile to save the calf. Or perhaps you noticed the elephant matriarch seeming to thank the hippo afterward." Grace shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of expectation. Her journal had become both her treasure and now somehow a source of conflict. The crew had offered to feature her prominently in their documentary, The School Teacher Who Witnessed a Miracle, they called it. For a woman who had spent 67 years in relative anonymity, the attention was intoxicating. "But that's not what happened," she said quietly. "The truth is extraordinary enough without embellishment." Marcus exchanged glances with his producer. "Audiences need drama, Grace. They need heroes and villains, and emotional connections." Later that evening, Grace found Naledi sitting alone by the campfire, her face tense in the flickering light. "The managers had a meeting today," the young tracker confided. "They're discussing moving the elephant herd closer to the main observation deck. They want to create a guaranteed elephant experience for guests." Grace felt her stomach tighten. Move them? How would they even do that? Controlled water access. They'd dry up certain areas, create artificial watering holes near viewing platforms. Naledi's voice cracked slightly. "The matriarch is already stressed from her injury. This could devastate the herd's natural patterns." Grace thought of her journal entries, the careful documentation of the elephants' movements, their family structures, the delicate balance they maintained with other species. The safari company was planning to manipulate this for profit, while the documentary crew wanted to distort her observations for entertainment. "They offered to fly me to London for interviews," Grace admitted. "Said I could be the face of their conservation segment." Naledi looked up sharply. "Will you do it?" Grace stared into the fire, remembering the Manchester classroom where she'd taught for 4 decades, always encouraging her students to stand for truth even when it was difficult. How could she do less now? "No," she said finally. "Neither the documentary people nor the camp managers understand what we've witnessed here. It's not a spectacle to be manufactured. It's a delicate relationship that deserves protection." Naledi reached across and squeezed the older woman's hand. "So what do we do?" Grace closed her journal with determination. "We tell the real story, and we find a way to protect these animals from becoming mere attractions." The camp's food stores dwindled alarmingly as the floods cut off regular supply routes to the Okavango Delta. What had begun as minor rationing quickly escalated into a full-blown crisis that threatened to divide the camp along lines of privilege and position. Tourists who had paid premium prices for their safari experience now found themselves facing the same empty plates as the staff who served them. Grace Thompson watched tensions rise during the morning meal when a businessman from London loudly demanded preferential treatment. The camp manager tried explaining that everyone needed to share equally, but his words fell on deaf ears. Several other guests joined the chorus of complaints while the local staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Perhaps we could approach this differently," Grace suggested, her voice soft but steady. The retired schoolteacher stood up, commanding attention not through volume, but through the quiet dignity that had become her hallmark at camp. "What if we pooled our skills instead of our grievances?" She proposed a system where everyone contributed according to their abilities. The staff knew which local plants were edible. Tourists with fishing experience could help supplement their protein intake. The documentary crew, with their technical knowledge, could rig solar charging stations to preserve what little refrigeration remained. Naledi supported Grace immediately. "My grandmother taught me which roots and berries are safe," the young tracker offered. "I can teach anyone willing to learn." What followed was a remarkable transformation. By afternoon, impromptu teams had formed. Grace organized a rotation schedule that paired staff with guests, ensuring knowledge transfer flowed both ways. The businessman who had complained earlier discovered he had a talent for devising efficient cooking methods that conserved their dwindling fuel supplies. Around the campfire that evening, as they shared a modest but satisfying meal of river fish and foraged greens, the atmosphere had changed completely. Laughter replaced complaints, and stories flowed freely between people who had previously regarded each other with suspicion. "In Manchester, I taught children from very different backgrounds," Grace confided to Naledi as they watched the newfound camaraderie. "I learned that shared challenges often build stronger bonds than shared comforts." The young tracker nodded thoughtfully. "My people have a saying, when the river dries, all animals drink from the same pool." As the days passed, Grace's mediation skills proved invaluable. When conflicts arose, she listened to all sides before suggesting compromises. Her journal now documented not just animal behavior, but human adaptability as well. The food crisis had unexpectedly created a microcosm of cooperation that mirrored the surprising alliances forming among the wildlife they had come to observe. By the time supply trucks finally arrived 2 weeks later, no one celebrated the end of shared hardship as much as the beginning of something far more valuable: genuine community. The unmistakable sound of distress echoed across the delta, a pained trumpet that made every hair on Grace's arms stand on end. From the observation platform, she watched in horror as the matriarch elephant collapsed on her side, blood seeping from a deep gash on her flank. The territorial dispute with a rival herd had turned violent, leaving the leader severely wounded and her family in disarray. "The herd won't survive without her," Naledi whispered, her voice tight with concern. "Predators will target the calves now." Grace clutched her journal to her chest, its pages filled with months of observations and sketches. The retired schoolteacher had documented every interaction between the elephants and hippos, every subtle shift in behavior. Now, watching the wounded matriarch struggle to rise, she felt utterly helpless. "We can't just stand here," Grace said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. The camp manager shook his head. "It's not our place to interfere. Nature must take its course." But Grace had spent too many years of her life standing aside, watching from the periphery. The same feeling that had haunted her in Manchester, that sense of powerlessness, threatened to overwhelm her again. She looked at the herd, at the baby elephant that had been saved months ago, now trumpeting in confusion around its fallen leader. "There must be something we can do," she insisted, turning to Naledi. The young tracker met her gaze, determination replacing fear. Within the hour, Grace found herself in a safari vehicle, alongside Naledi and 2 guides. They carried medical supplies and moved cautiously toward the injured matriarch. The plan was simple, yet dangerous. Create a protective perimeter that would keep predators at bay while the elephant had time to recover. "Stay in the vehicle," warned one of the guides as they approached. "If she charges, we retreat immediately." Grace nodded, heart pounding against her ribs. She watched as Naledi expertly assessed the situation, directing the vehicle to positions that would deter scavengers without threatening the herd. For 3 days, they maintained their vigil, taking shifts to ensure the matriarch was protected. Grace used her journal to track the elephant's progress, noting with relief when the massive animal finally managed to stand again. "She's going to make it," Naledi said on the 4th morning, squeezing Grace's hand. The older woman smiled, a profound sense of purpose washing over her. She had chosen action over observation, courage over caution. As the matriarch rejoined her waiting herd, Grace understood that she too had found her place, not as a passive witness, but as a guardian of the life that had come to mean everything to her. The shifting landscape of the delta had forced the hippopod into new territory, bringing them uncomfortably close to the elephant herd's preferred grazing areas. Grace Thompson watched from the observation platform, pencil poised over her journal, anticipating the territorial clash that seemed inevitable. The camp. Guides had warned everyone to keep their distance, fearing aggression between the two largest mammals in the region. "They should be fighting," Naledi whispered, binoculars trained on the riverbank. "This is not normal behavior." Instead of hostility, something remarkable was unfolding. The hippos had positioned themselves along the shallower parts of the river, creating an unintentional barrier between the drinking elephants and the deeper waters where crocodiles lurked. The tracker pointed out how the matriarch seemed to recognize this arrangement, leading her herd to water precisely where the hippopod rested. Grace sketched furiously, capturing the scene with quick, practiced strokes. "It's as if they've formed an alliance," she murmured, her Manchester accent softening with awe. When a young male lion approached the riverbank, the reaction was immediate. 3 massive hippos rose partially from the water, their bulk intimidating enough to send the predator retreating. The elephants continued drinking, seemingly unbothered, while the youngest calves, including the one rescued months earlier, stayed safely between adult elephants and the hippo sentinels. "I've never seen anything like this in 15 years of tracking," Naledi admitted, her usual professional reserve cracking with excitement. Back at camp, Grace's documentation became the center of attention. The safari guides gathered around her journal, examining her detailed sketches and notes. What she had recorded wasn't just unusual. It was unprecedented. The hippos weren't merely tolerating the elephants. They were actively deterring other predators from approaching. "This changes everything we understand about interspecies dynamics," one of the senior guides explained to the gathered tourists. "These animals are adapting to the changing conditions together." The documentary crew, initially skeptical, now filmed the phenomenon with renewed interest. Their director approached Grace with newfound respect, no longer pressuring her to embellish, but eager to capture the truth of what was happening. That evening, as the sun set over the delta, Grace added the day's observations to her growing collection. The old schoolteacher reflected on how these animals, supposedly driven purely by instinct, had found ways to coexist that benefited both species. The interconnectedness of the ecosystem wasn't just scientific fact. It was unfolding before her eyes as a living, breathing reality. "Perhaps," she wrote in her journal, "we humans could learn something from them after all." The storm came without warning, a wall of water and wind that descended on the camp with terrifying speed. Grace Thompson clutched her journal to her chest as she hurried toward her tent, rain pelting her face like tiny needles. 6 months of observations, sketches, and reflections, her entire journey, resided in those pages. "Everyone inside!" shouted one of the guides, his voice barely audible above. The howling wind. The Okavango was reclaiming its territory, water rising inch by inch around their ankles. Inside her tent, Grace found chaos. Water had already seeped through the canvas floor, creating a shallow pool that threatened her belongings. She placed her journal on the highest surface, her bedside table, and began salvaging what she could. Outside, the storm intensified, the sound of thunder cracking overhead like the earth splitting apart. A sudden gust lifted the corner of her tent, sending a wave of muddy water surging inside. Grace watched in horror as her journal slid from the table and landed with a sickening splash in the rising water. She lunged forward, but the current had already carried it toward the entrance flap. "No!" she cried, scrambling after it. The journal, containing every detail of the elephant calf's rescue, the hippo's intervention, the matriarch's injury, was disappearing before her eyes. The tent flap suddenly opened, revealing Naledi, drenched and breathless. The young tracker's eyes widened as she spotted the journal floating toward her. "I've got it!" Naledi snatched the sodden book from the water, holding it up triumphantly. Her quick reflexes had saved months of irreplaceable observations. The two women huddled together as camp staff secured the tent. Grace carefully opened the journal, her heart sinking at the sight of bleeding ink and warped pages. Some entries remained legible, others had dissolved into watercolor smudges. "We can salvage this," Naledi said, gently separating pages to prevent further damage. "My grandmother taught me how to dry paper without destroying it." Through the night, as the storm gradually subsided, Grace and Naledi worked together. They hung pages from makeshift clotheslines, photographed the most damaged sections with Naledi's smartphone, and transcribed what they could remember of the lost passages. "Memory is fragile," Grace said, carefully blotting a page containing her sketch of the hippo standing guard over the elephant calf. "Just like life here in the Delta." Naledi nodded. "But that doesn't make it less valuable." By morning, much of the journal had been preserved, What couldn't be saved physically now existed digitally and in their shared recollections. The near loss had only strengthened Grace's resolve to complete her documentation of this extraordinary place and its inhabitants. "I won't let this story be forgotten," she promised, her voice steady with newfound determination. The retired schoolteacher had discovered her purpose here, among the flooded plains of Botswana, and not even the delta itself could wash it away. The early morning sun cast a golden glow across the delta as Grace sat on the veranda, her weathered journal open on her lap. What had begun as personal observations had transformed into something far greater. Representatives from the Botswana Wildlife Conservation Society had arrived yesterday, specifically requesting to meet the Manchester Observer, whose detailed documentation had captured international attention. "They want to use your methods as a template," Naledi explained, her eyes bright with excitement. The young tracker had blossomed over these months, her knowledge now sought after by senior guides. "Your journal will help create observation protocols for camps across the Delta." Grace could hardly believe it. 6 months ago, she had been just another tourist, her sketches and notes dismissed as the sentimental scribblings of an elderly woman. Now, local community leaders had invited her to speak at their council meeting about the unusual animal behaviors she'd documented. "The elders say your respect for our traditions shows in how you write about the animals," Naledi told her, sitting beside Grace on the wooden bench. "They've never seen anyone connect our stories with scientific observation before." The safari company that once considered relocating elephants for tourist appeal had reversed course entirely. Instead, they were establishing protected corridors based on Grace's mapped patterns of hippo and elephant movement. Her documentation of the unusual guardianship between species had convinced them that this natural phenomenon could become their most valuable attraction. "We've received funding," the camp manager announced during dinner, "for Naledi's education program." He nodded toward the young woman, acknowledging her with newfound respect. "The university in Cape Town has offered her a scholarship in wildlife management, with guaranteed employment here afterward." Tears welled in Naledi's eyes as applause erupted around the campfire. She reached for Grace's hand, squeezing it tightly. "This wouldn't have happened without you," she whispered. "Nonsense," Grace replied, though her heart swelled with pride. "You always had this knowledge. I just helped others see it." Later that evening, as fireflies danced above the receding waters, a representative from an international conservation group presented Grace with a new leather-bound journal. "For your continued observations," the woman said, "your work has created a bridge between traditional knowledge and modern conservation. We need more of this approach." Grace ran her fingers over the smooth cover, remembering how she'd arrived in Botswana seeking escape from invisibility. Now her words would help protect this land long after she returned to Manchester. "I came here to find meaning," she told Naledi as they watched Hippo's surface in the distance. "I never expected to help create it." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Okavango Delta as Grace stood at the riverbank, her journal clutched against her chest. 6 months had passed since she'd watched a hippo save a baby elephant from certain death. The waters had receded, leaving behind a transformed landscape, much like the transformation within herself. "I hardly recognize the woman who arrived here," she whispered to Naledi, who stood beside her sketching the hippopod lounging in the distance. The young tracker smiled, her keen eyes never leaving her subject. "The Delta changes everyone who truly sees it," Naledi replied. Grace ran her fingers over the worn leather cover of her journal, now filled with hundreds of observations, sketches, and reflections. What had begun as a retirement trip to escape loneliness in Manchester had become the most meaningful chapter of her 67 years. The retired schoolteacher had discovered purpose in documenting the unusual alliance between species that scientists were now studying with great interest. The matriarch elephant and her herd appeared on the opposite bank, the once injured leader now moving with renewed strength. Among them trotted the calf whose rescue had started everything, no longer tiny but still recognizable by the distinctive notch in its right ear. The elephants paused, seeming to acknowledge the humans before continuing their journey. "Your project funding came through," Naledi said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The conservation group wants to expand the observation program to 3 more camps." Grace nodded, a quiet pride filling her chest. Her meticulous notes, once dismissed as the sentimental scribblings of a tourist, had become the foundation for a wildlife protection initiative spanning the Delta. More importantly, they had secured Naledi's scholarship to study wildlife management in Cape Town. Behind them, the camp bustled with morning activity. Staff who had once regarded Grace with polite distance now greeted her as family. Even the documentary, despite its sensationalist title, had captured enough truth to raise awareness about the delicate ecosystem of the Delta. The crew had departed weeks ago, leaving behind equipment that the camp now used for their own documentation efforts. "I came here feeling powerless," Grace said, watching a hippo rise from the water in a gesture that now felt like a greeting. "I never imagined I would find my voice in silence, my purpose in observation." As they turned back toward camp, Grace paused for one last look at the river, the place where a single act of unexpected kindness between species had triggered a ripple effect that transformed not just her life, but the lives of everyone at the camp. The fear of insignificance that had haunted her for decades had finally released its grip. The Delta had taught her that even the smallest actions could create lasting change, a lesson worth every palace she'd spent to come here, every page she'd filled, and every moment she'd stayed to witness the unfolding miracle.